I stood at the foot of the staircase, the old wood groaning beneath my weight as if the house itself were warning me to turn back. The dim light filtering through the stained glass windows cast long, twisted shadows on the walls, making the Victorian mansion feel more like a mausoleum than a home. I hadn't been back here in years, not since my mother and I had our falling out. But now, with her gone, the task of sorting through her belongings had fallen to me, her only child. The air inside the house was thick, heavy with the scent of dust and something else, something I couldn't quite place. It was as if the very walls were saturated with the secrets of a bygone era. My footsteps echoed through the empty halls as I made my way to the study, where my mother had spent most of her time in her final years. The door creaked open with a reluctant sigh, revealing the room that had always felt off-limits, even to me. The study was just as I remembered it, lined with shelves of old books, their spines cracked and faded, and a large, ornate desk cluttered with papers. But now, everything seemed different, more sinister. The light from the single window was weak, barely illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. My eyes were drawn to the portrait hanging above the fireplace, an oil painting of my mother, her eyes cold and piercing. It had always unnerved me as a child, the way those eyes seemed to follow me wherever I went. Now, standing alone in that room, I felt them bore into me, as if she were watching my every move. I shook off the feeling and began the grim task of sorting through her things. Her desk was a chaotic mix of letters, old photographs, and journals. I picked up one of the photographs, the edges yellowed with age. The image showed a group of people standing in front of the house, their faces blurred and indistinct, as if time itself had tried to erase them. But one thing was clear: my mother was not among them. I had no idea who these people were, yet there was something familiar about them, something that made my skin crawl. As I sifted through more of her papers, I came across a series of cryptic notes written in my mother's meticulous handwriting. They were filled with references to events and names I didn't recognize, and warnings that sent a shiver down my spine. Do not trust the shadows. They are watching. The house knows. What did she mean by this? I had never known my mother to be superstitious or prone to flights of fancy. But as I read those words, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was trying to tell me something, even from beyond the grave. The hours slipped away as I lost myself in the puzzle of her life, piecing together fragments of a woman I had never truly known. Each discovery seemed to draw me deeper into a web of secrets, and the more I uncovered, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the house itself was reacting to my presence, the air growing colder, the shadows lengthening, and the silence thickening until it was almost unbearable. Finally, I pulled open the bottom drawer of her desk and found something that made my heart skip a beat: a small, leather-bound journal. The cover was worn, the pages brittle with age. I hesitated before opening it, as if some part of me knew that whatever lay within those pages would change everything. But curiosity won out, and I carefully turned the first page. Inside was a single sentence, written in my mother's hand: "The truth is buried deep, but it will not stay hidden forever." As I stared at those words, I felt a cold dread settle in the pit of my stomach. This was no ordinary inheritance. Whatever my mother had been hiding, it was now mine to uncover. And somehow I knew that the house that had always watched, always waited, would not make it easy. The attic had always been a place of unease, even when I was a child. My mother rarely allowed me up there, claiming it was filled with nothing but old furniture and forgotten memories. But now, as I stood at the bottom of the narrow staircase leading up to that dusty space, I felt an inexplicable pull, as if something was urging me to climb those creaking steps. The attic door groaned in protest as I pushed it open, revealing a cavernous room cluttered with boxes, old trunks, and furniture draped in yellowing sheets. A single, bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a sickly yellow light over the scene. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decaying wood, and every step I took stirred up clouds of dust that made me cough. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Perhaps some forgotten memento, a keepsake from my mother's past that might help me understand the strange things I had been uncovering downstairs. But as I began to sift through the boxes, I realized that many of them were filled with things I had never seen before. Old photographs, letters written in a language I didn't recognize, and books that looked far older than the house itself. As I moved deeper into the attic, I noticed something odd. One of the bookshelves, crammed with dusty volumes, seemed out of place. The books were stacked haphazardly, some even upside down, as if someone had shoved them there in a hurry. And behind them, the wall didn't match the rest of the attic. It was made of a different kind of wood, darker and less aged. My heart began to race as I pushed the books aside, revealing a small, nearly invisible seam in the wall. With trembling hands, I pried at the seam, and to my astonishment, the wall gave way, revealing a narrow door hidden behind the bookshelf. The door was small, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through, and it looked ancient. Its wood warped and splintered with age. There was no handle, only a small, rusted keyhole. I hesitated for a moment, my breath coming in short gasps as I stared at the door. What was this? Why had it been hidden so carefully? But there was no turning back now. I had to know what lay beyond. I found an old, rusty key on the floor nearby, as if it had been waiting for me. With a deep breath, I inserted the key into the lock. It resisted at first, but then, with a loud click, the door swung open, revealing a dark, narrow passage that seemed to stretch on forever. The air inside the passage was different, stale and cold, as if it hadn't been disturbed in decades. I fumbled for my phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal a small, windowless room at the end of the passage. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were dozens of journals, all bound in the same worn leather, each one marked with a date. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking ominously beneath my weight. The room felt impossibly old, older than the house itself. It was as if I had stepped into another time, another world entirely. My hands shook as I reached for the nearest journal, the leather soft and cracked from years of neglect. I opened it and began to read, my eyes widening with each word. The journals were my mother's, but they were unlike anything I had ever imagined. They detailed strange rituals, ceremonies held in the dead of night, in secret places hidden deep within the woods. There were drawings of symbols I didn't recognize, diagrams of strange formations, and notes written in a frantic, almost desperate hand. My mother had written about things that couldn't possibly be real, shadows that moved of their own accord, whispers in the dark, and a presence that watched from the corners of her vision. But the further I read, the more I realized that she had believed in them, truly believed. And then I found the letters. They were tucked into the back of one of the journals, tied together with a brittle piece of twine. The paper was yellowed and fragile, the ink faded but still legible. They were addressed to my mother, but the handwriting was not hers. The letters spoke of a curse, a dark legacy that had haunted our family for generations. The writer warned my mother that she could not escape it, that it was in her blood, and that it would soon come for her and for me. My hands were cold, my heart pounding in my chest as I read those words. It felt as though the walls were closing in around me, the air growing thicker, heavier. The room seemed to darken, the shadows deepening as the truth settled over me like a shroud. This was the inheritance my mother had left me, a legacy of fear and darkness, a curse that had been hidden away, locked behind a door that should never have been opened. I had thought I was uncovering my mother's secrets, but now I realized that those secrets were uncovering me. The room, the journals, the letters, they were all part of something much larger, something that had been waiting in the shadows, biding its time. And now it had found me. It started with whispers, soft and indistinct, like the murmur of a distant conversation just beyond the edge of hearing. At first, I thought it was the wind, the old house creaking and groaning as it settled in the night. But as the days passed and I delved deeper into my mother's journals, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until I could no longer ignore them. They came at night, when the house was still and the darkness outside pressed against the windows like a living thing. I would lie in bed, the silence heavy around me, and then, just as I was about to drift off, I would hear them. Faint voices too quiet to make out, but unmistakably there. They seemed to come from the walls, from the very bones of the house, as if the wood and stone had absorbed the echoes of long-forgotten conversations. At first, I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, the result of too many hours spent reading those cursed journals. But the more I read, the worse it became. The voices grew clearer, more defined, as if they were moving closer, converging on me. I could hear them calling my name, whispering secrets in a language I didn't understand. I would bolt upright in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. But when I turned on the light, the room was empty. Still, the feeling lingered, a sense that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me from the shadows. During the day, the house was no less unsettling. It had always been a place of unease, but now it felt alive, as if it were waking up after a long slumber. I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting across the hallway, a flicker of light where there should have been none. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. Yet the feeling of being watched was constant, a pressure that weighed on me, making it hard to breathe. The rooms that had once been so familiar now seemed foreign, their shapes and angles distorted in the dim light. The wallpaper, once faded and peeling, now appeared to writhe with a life of its own, the patterns shifting and twisting when I wasn't looking directly at them. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I tried to focus on the journals, hoping that by understanding my mother's secrets, I might dispel the growing sense of dread. But the more I read, the more the house seemed to react. The temperature would drop suddenly, leaving me shivering despite the summer heat. Objects would move on their own, books sliding off shelves, doors creaking open or slamming shut with no breeze to explain it. And always, there were the voices, growing louder, more insistent, until they drowned out my thoughts, filling my mind with their whispered warnings. One night, as I sat in the study with one of the journals open in front of me, I felt a presence behind me. Cold, oppressive, and unmistakably malevolent. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, too terrified to turn around. The air seemed to crackle with energy, and I could hear the faintest sound of breathing, slow and deliberate. The room was plunged into a suffocating silence, broken only by the ticking of the old clock on the wall. With every ounce of courage I could muster, I forced myself to turn, expecting to see someone or something standing there. But the room was empty, the shadows long and deep, stretching across the floor like black tendrils. Yet I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes on me, watching, waiting. From that moment on, the boundary between reality and nightmare began to blur. I would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, only to find myself standing in the hallway, the cold floorboards biting into my bare feet. I had no memory of how I got there, but the whispers would surround me, pressing in from all sides, filling my mind with fragmented images of things I couldn't understand. I started to doubt my own sanity, questioning whether the house was truly haunted or if I was simply losing my mind. The journals spoke of dark rituals, of sacrifices made to appease ancient forces that demanded blood. My mother had warned of a curse, but she had never said how to stop it. Now I feared that it was too late, that I had already fallen under its spell. Every corner of the house held a new terror, a flash of movement in a mirror, a cold hand brushing against my arm, the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls when no one was there. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I would see faces in the darkness, twisted and angry, their mouths open in silent screams. I could feel the house closing in on me, its malevolent force growing stronger with each passing day, feeding on my fear. I no longer knew what was real and what was a product of my own unraveling mind. The house had become a maze of horrors, each room a trap designed to drive me deeper into madness. I was caught in its web, unable to escape, unable to think clearly. The more I fought it, the stronger it became, until I was left with only one terrifying thought. The house didn't just want to protect its secrets. It wanted to consume me. The final journal sat in my lap like a lead weight, its pages worn thin from years of handling. as if it had been read and reread countless times. I had put off opening it for as long as I could, fearing what I might find within its pages. But now, after everything that had happened, the whispers, the shadows, the overwhelming sense of being hunted, I knew that I had no choice. Whatever truth my mother had buried in this cursed house was waiting for me here, in these pages. It was time to face it. I opened the journal with trembling hands, the musty smell of old paper filling the air. The handwriting was my mother's, but it was different now. Hastily scrawled, jagged, as if written in a frenzy. The words tumbled across the page, half-formed thoughts and disjointed sentences, all pointing to something terrible, something she had been trying to warn me about. My eyes raced over the lines, piecing together the fragments of a story I had never wanted to know. It started with my great-grandmother, a woman I had only ever heard whispers about, her name spoken in hushed tones at family gatherings. She had been the first to make the pact, driven by desperation in the face of unimaginable loss. My family had been plagued by misfortune. Children lost to illness, crops failing, financial ruin. And in her despair, she had turned to something ancient and malevolent for help. The details were vague, lost to time, but the essence of it was clear. She had offered something of herself, something precious, in exchange for protection. And so the curse had begun. The pact had saved the family, yes, but at a terrible cost. The protection it offered was not without its price. Each generation was forced to renew the pact, to offer a sacrifice that grew more horrifying with each passing year. My great-grandmother had given up her soul, and those who followed her had been forced to do the same, each one leaving behind a piece of themselves to keep the curse at bay. My mother had been no different. The journal detailed her own descent into madness as she fought against the dark forces that surrounded our family. She had tried to break the cycle, to find a way out, but the pact was unbreakable, a chain forged in blood and fear. She had made her own sacrifice, sealing the pact once again, but she had known that it was only a temporary reprieve. The curse could not be defeated, only delayed. And now, with her death, the full fury of the curse had been unleashed. The house had come alive with the malevolent force that had haunted our family for generations, and it was coming for me. I was the next in line, the last of our blood, and the pact demanded its due. My mother had tried to warn me, to prepare me, but nothing could have readied me for the truth. I read on, my heart pounding in my chest as the terrible reality of my situation became clear. The final entries in the journal were written in a frantic, desperate hand, the ink smeared as if she had been trembling with fear. She wrote of visions, of shadowy figures that followed her, of a presence that grew stronger every day, whispering to her, calling her name. She had fought against it, but in the end, she had known there was no escape. Her last entry was a single, chilling sentence. "It's your turn now." The journal slipped from my hands, hitting the floor with a dull thud. I felt the walls of the room closing in around me, the shadows stretching and twisting as if they were alive. The whispers that had haunted me for days now rose to a deafening chorus, filling my ears with their insidious promises. I could feel the house pulsing with dark energy, its ancient hunger focused entirely on me. I was trapped. There was no way out, no way to escape the fate that had been sealed long before I was born. The house would not let me leave, not until the pact was fulfilled, not until the curse had claimed its next victim. I could feel it in every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, every shadow that loomed in the corners of my vision. The house was alive with the power of the curse, a force that had been building for generations, and now it was ready to collect what it was owed. I stood up, my legs shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The realization hit me like a physical blow. There was no one else left. I was the last of my family, the final link in a chain of suffering and death. The curse was mine to bear, and there was no escaping it. The house would consume me, just as it had consumed those who came before me, feeding on my fear, my soul, until there was nothing left. I could feel the presence growing stronger, closing in on me, the air thick with its malevolence. The walls seemed to pulse with life, the shadows deepening as they reached for me, cold fingers brushing against my skin. I could hear the whispers again, louder now, insistent, calling my name over and over, urging me to give in, to accept my fate. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. My mother had fought against it, and I would too. Even if it was hopeless, even if there was no escape, I would not go quietly into the darkness. I would fight with everything I had until the very end. I would not let the curse take me without a struggle. I turned and ran, fleeing from the room, from the journals, from the terrible truth that I had uncovered. But as I raced down the hallway, the walls seemed to stretch, the doors slamming shut before I could reach them. The house was alive with the power of the curse, a malevolent force that would not be denied. The whispers followed me, growing louder and louder, until they were all I could hear, drowning out my thoughts, filling my mind with their terrible chorus. There was no escape. The house had me now, and it would not let me go. The house was suffocating me. Every room I entered felt smaller, the walls closing in, the shadows stretching longer, darker. The whispers were relentless now, a constant hum of voices that circled me, tugging at the edges of my sanity. They weren't just coming from the walls anymore. They were inside my head, burrowing deep, rooting themselves in my thoughts. I couldn't think straight, couldn't breathe. The air was thick with the weight of centuries of secrets, of terror, of despair. I knew what the house wanted. It had made its demand clear. My mother's sacrifice wasn't enough. The curse required more. It required me. I could feel it in every fiber of my being. A pull, an inevitability that threatened to drag me down into the same abyss that had claimed my ancestors. I was the last of our bloodline, the final link in a chain forged in dark rituals and blood. The house would not rest until I fulfilled the pact, until I gave myself over to the darkness. But I couldn't accept that. I wouldn't. My mother had fought against it, but in the end, she had succumbed, leaving me to face the curse alone. Now it was my turn to choose. Would I continue the cycle, become just another victim of this malevolent force? Or would I find a way to break free, to end this once and for all? The journal's final words echoed in my mind. It's your turn now. I looked around the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadows were closing in, thick and suffocating, like a living thing. I could feel the presence, that malevolent force, pressing against me from all sides, urging me to submit. The house wanted me to give in, to accept my fate, to continue the cycle of horror that had plagued my family for generations. But I wasn't ready to give up, not yet. With a sudden burst of determination, I bolted from the room, my footsteps echoing down the hallway as I ran. The whispers chased me, growing louder, more frantic, as if they knew what I was planning. The walls seemed to pulse with anger, the floorboards creaking underfoot as the house itself resisted my attempt to escape. But I couldn't stop. I had to find a way out. There had to be a way. The front door was just ahead, its old wood swollen with age, but it was my only chance. My fingers fumbled with the lock, my heart racing as I glanced over my shoulder. The shadows were closing in, reaching out with twisted tendrils, their darkness absolute. I could feel the presence looming behind me, its cold breath on the back of my neck, the weight of its malevolence pressing down on me. With a desperate cry, I yanked the door open and stumbled out into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, sharp and bracing, but I didn't stop to breathe it in. I kept running, my feet pounding against the gravel path as I fled from the house, from the curse, from everything. I could still hear the whispers, faint now, fading into the distance as I put more ground between myself and that place of terror. But as I ran, something held me back. A thought, a whisper. Not from the house, but from deep within myself. Could I truly escape? Or was I simply prolonging the inevitable? The curse was in my blood, a part of me as much as it had been a part of my mother. And no matter how far I ran, could I ever really be free of it? I slowed to a stop, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and turned to look back at the house. It loomed in the darkness, a silhouette against the night sky, its windows dark and empty. The whispers were gone, but the feeling of being watched remained, a heavy weight that pressed down on my shoulders. I knew the house was still waiting for me, still expecting me to fulfill the pact. And I knew that as long as I lived, the curse would follow me, a shadow that I could never escape. But what if I could end it? What if there was a way to break the curse, to sever the ties that bound me to that place? The journals had spoken of rituals, of sacrifices, but they had never mentioned a way out. Perhaps it was hopeless, but I had to try. I couldn't live the rest of my life running from this darkness, knowing it would eventually catch up with me. I had two choices: go back and face whatever was waiting for me, or keep running, knowing that no matter how far I went, the curse would always be there, just a step behind. I stood there, torn between the two, my heart pounding, my mind racing. The night was silent now, the wind still, the world holding its breath as it waited for my decision. Finally, I made my choice. The ground beneath my feet felt solid as I took a step forward. Then another, my decision echoing in every footfall. I didn't know if it was the right choice, if it would lead to my salvation or my doom. But it was my choice, and that was all that mattered. The house loomed in the distance, dark and silent, but no longer a place of fear. I wasn't running anymore. I was walking toward it, ready to face whatever awaited me inside. Whether I would find a way to break the curse or become its next victim, I couldn't say. But I would face it on my terms. As I approached the front door, the whispers began again, faint and distant, like a memory of a dream. I hesitated for just a moment, my hand on the doorknob, before I pushed it open and stepped inside. The door closed behind me with a final, echoing thud. And then there was silence.